All right, well, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Unlocking Efficiency, How Accounts Payable Can Lead a Seamless Procure-to-Pay Transformation, brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by TradeShift. I do have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we officially get started. First, if you're having any technical issues, we do recommend you refreshing your browser. That seems to solve most issues. But if you continue to have any issues, please use the Q&A box and I will respond right away. Also note there is no call-in number for today's session. To connect, you just need to have access to either a computer, tablet, or cell phone for audio, and everyone's lines have been muted. So that you don't miss any shared content or an opportunity to share valuable feedback with us, we do recommend you enabling pop-ups within your browser for this webinar. For your convenience, everything in the webinar console is fully customizable, so you can move things around, resize the windows, and even turn on captions for this event. And at the bottom of the console, you'll find the resources box. This is where you can download the slides from today's webinar. Also, please be prepared to answer 3 polling questions during the webinar. The polls will appear in the slides window during the presentation. Please choose from the multiple choice answers and hit submit. We would love your participation and insight today. And as always, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A box, and we will do our best to leave time at the end of the webinar to run a Q&A with our speakers and get through as many questions as time allows. If we're not able to get to all questions, we'll make sure to forward those off to the sponsor for follow-up via email. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a thank you email with the on-demand materials within 2 business days. So this will include a link to access this webinar console again, so you can replay the webinar, download the slides as needed. And with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We have Mark Brousseau and Rowan Lemley. First up, we have Mark. Over the past 30 years, Mark has established himself as a thought leader on accounts payable, accounts receivable, payments, and document automation. A popular speaker at industry conferences and on webinars and podcasts, Brousseau advises prominent end users and solutions and services providers on how to use automation to improve document and payments-driven business processes. Brousseau has chaired numerous educational conferences and has served on several industry committees and boards. He resides in Center City, Philadelphia with his wife and 3 sons. We also have Rowan Lemley as the Director of Product Marketing at TradeShift, where he and his team supports the GTM efforts for procure-to-pay, e-invoicing, and fintech solutions. With over 15 years in tech and software as a service, Rowan has been known for translating complex product capabilities into impactful customer-centric narratives. His leadership drives TradeShift's brand presence, aligning cross-functional teams to deliver campaigns that engage both enterprise and mid-market audiences, supporting TradeShift's mission to digitize and transform global commerce. And at this time, I'd like to welcome our speakers and hand the webinar off to Rowan.
Thank you so much, Laura. Man, that intro was a bit over the top. My team. Fantastic.
You're a legend.
Hey, Mark,
You're a legend, Rowan.
I liked your intro. Anyways, this is going to be fun. It's going to be conversational. So everyone who's listening, if you've got questions, throw them in. We'll get to them at the end. And as Laura said, if we can't, we will answer you after the fact. I am going to give you a brief intro to TradeShift, just 2 slides. It'll be pretty quick, and then we will talk about the challenges within purchase to pay for the mid-market. But to be fair, it's not just the mid-market, it's enterprise as well. We will segue into the path for a seamless procure to pay, and then hopefully give you some tips around practical collaboration, and then we'll tie it all together, and we'll have a little bit of fun. All right. Jumping in, priorities and reality. And I'll just use this moment to talk a little bit about TradeShift. If you don't know TradeShift, we've been around for about 14, 15 years, and we've managed to build quite a good network in that space and time. So we've got 190 different countries connected. We're doing about 3 million invoices monthly with about 1 million onboarded suppliers and quite a few connections every month. You can see down at the bottom, that's essentially what we do: e-invoicing and clearance, payables automation, procurement, B2B marketplaces, embedded finance. I'll leave it at that. This isn't a sales pitch. You can find out more if you want to find out. But I will say, and again, this is my last slide, that we do like to think of ourselves as a strategic choice at the center of your digital transformation. And we are going to talk about digital transformation today. As we talk about digital transformation, I'll expand on what I mean. Mark will give his opinion. From my perspective, we've got two main stakeholder groups: the buyers and their sellers on the Tradeshift network. And these are the, let's say, these are the stakeholders who are going to interact with procurement, payables, and receivables processes as they go through the motions of procure to pay. And then they'll transact documents like orders and invoices. They'll do it compliantly. And if they're lucky enough and mature enough, they'll have some element of embedded fintech to help them with either spend management or supply chain financing. So this is the intro to Tradeshift. It's a network, it's a platform. It's both, in essence. All right. So challenges in purchase to pay for the mid-market companies. Mark, you've got a survey or a poll that will kick us off.
Yeah, let's find out what it is that you folks are challenged with by taking a look at your priorities. We want to know, within the context of procure to pay process, where do you plan to invest over the next 12 months? Which of the following areas do you plan to invest in your procure to pay process over the next 12 months? Supplier relationship management? Do you plan to invest in catalog management? Do you plan to invest in rec to order? Do you plan to invest in digitization, maybe e-invoicing? Do you plan to invest in invoice to pay? Do you plan to invest in ESG, CSR initiatives? Do you plan to invest in reporting and analytics? Or do you have no planned investments for 2025? Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we'll discuss those results in just a moment. So Rowan, when you're talking to accounts payable leaders these days, what is top of mind for them? What's their biggest priority these days, and how has that changed compared to a few years ago?
The biggest change is the rise in clearance and various compliance regimes around e-invoicing. For me and for Tradeshift, Tradeshift is global, but it might be like 60% the rest of the world and 40% North America. So for the North American audience, they might not see a lot of compliance, jumping up and basically becoming a priority. But for a lot of the larger companies, a lot of the rest of the world, South America, Europe, Asia, compliance is really pretty huge. So digitizing and e-invoicing would be number one. Invoice to pay, it's perennial in terms of efficiency, cost savings. Rec to order, catalog management, they're pretty important too. Reporting and analytics, maybe a little bit, I don't want to say out of vogue, but we're hearing less. Maybe it's because everyone's building it into the platform.
Yeah. We saw a big push several years back to move toward procure to pay automation, thinking holistically about P2P, and that's the focus of today's webinar. Have organizations slowed down in their drive to P2P automation? Is it more segmented these days, or are we still seeing a big push toward P2P automation?
It might be more segmented. I think there's a little bit, I'll talk a little bit later about sort of priorities, CFO priorities. There's, I think there's less cheap money out there to invest. I think there's a little bit more circumspection around where to invest. So rather than a big bang approach to digital transformation, it might be a little bit more tactical. I know we're talking today about procure to pay broadly, but I do think that there's a starting point, and I do think that companies are really thinking hard about where to spend their money, and they're not spending it easily.
We asked you, within the context of the procure to pay process, where do you plan new investments in the next 12 months? Well, look at this. 27% of our attendees, say they plan to make investments in supplier relationship management. 25% of our attendees plan to make investments in their invoice to pay. 18% of you say you plan to make investments in rec to order. And 14% of you are making investments in catalog management. Another 17% of you plan to make investments in digitization and e-invoicing. With all that said, 1/4 of our attendees, Rowan, say they have no planned investments in 2025. Two things stand out. Two things stand out to me. Number one, 27% of our attendees identified supplier relationship management as their top priority. What's going on there?
I love it because I mean, I'm a huge proponent of collaborating with suppliers, and I do believe it could be a reaction of the sort of the COVID breakdown in supply chains and the realization that source of supply was actually vital to production and whatnot. So it could be a reaction to that. It could just be it could simply be that the audience has done the invoice to pay, has done the rec to order, and they're moving maybe upstream to supplier relationship management. I think I'm kind of interested to see this ESG CSR number of 1.4, because there's a lot of hype around that, but clearly not a lot of investment, not in this audience.
I'm not even sure that somebody did hit that by accident, Rowan. I mean, I want to know more about supplier relationship management. If you were one of those 27% of our attendees who identified that as a priority for 2025, I'm not letting you off the hook. Go ahead, fire up your Q&A tool on your screen right now, and I want you to let me know what it is that's driving those investments. What is it that you're after? What is the driver behind it? Let me know why it is that you're so keen on prioritizing supplier relationship management. Meantime, Rowan, I can't help but bring this up. 24% of our attendees have no planned investments for 2025. What would be your biggest message to those folks?
You know, I mean, obviously I'm a vendor, so I would love them to have the confidence to spend, but I understand it. It's a difficult market. Companies are on the sidelines by choice. CFOs are keeping their powder dry. So I don't begrudge them. I think it's interesting as an observation, and it is what it is. It is what it is. I think it's not because of the business case. Now, we know the business case is fairly, I would say, very solid for digital transformation, incredibly solid for the invoice to pay and the cost savings associated with that. And then, of course, managing spend, there's a lot to be said for the business case there. SRM, maybe somebody will chime in and tell us the business case for SRM. But yeah, 25% sitting on the sidelines. I'm not shocked.
Yeah. So let's talk about the pain points, Rowan. What are you seeing when it comes to the most common pain points in procure to pay?
Yeah, so these numbers come from two different industry benchmark reports, procurement on the left, AP on the right. And I do think it's kind of interesting. And of course, I'm interested in whether or not these the audience sees themselves in these numbers. But I look at like stakeholder engagement, system and process alignment, managing suppliers. I see a lot of need to collaborate between stakeholders, suppliers, and systems, right? And then on the right-hand side, on the AP side, slow invoice to pay, too many exceptions, high invoice processing costs. For me, these all relate to the need for efficiency, the need to demonstrate an ROI around the investment for invoice to pay, and I essentially I feel like maybe efficiency and control on the AP side are the right themes to pull out of this. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's funny because when I looked at these stats, Rowan, it occurred to me when I look at the AP numbers, slow invoice cycles, too many exceptions, and late supplier payments, they really are all the same thing, right? And what I hear from AP leaders these days is that it's harder and harder to get approvals on invoices now that we're all working remotely at least part of the time. It's difficult to be able to get things approved on time unless we're in a highly automated environment. And that's especially true if you're in a paper environment, but that's also true if you're in an emailed environment, right? Let's face it. Emails get misrouted, they get lost, they get deleted inadvertently, they get ignored. It's impossible to get anyone on a phone. It's hard to know who an invoice should go to. And so this all rolls up into an environment where it's harder these days to pay folks accurately and on time. And then we move over to the left-hand column, and this has an impact on our suppliers. And for years, when we talk about AP automation, the last thing we talk about is the impact on the supplier. And for years, we had some vendors who took a draconian approach to automation, force your supplier to do things in a particular way. And that's hard for suppliers. They've got enough on their plate. And so I think this is why we need to have this holistic conversation, Rowan, about this yin and yang here, because what we do on the AP side has big implications to our supply chain, and things like automation can help us with engagement. It's easier to collaborate with suppliers. It can help us get visibility into our spending, which can help us manage our budgets. It can help us align our processes with our suppliers' processes. We can provide them with better, richer remittance data so they can more easily apply those payments. So this is kind of the environment we're in, where I think we're becoming more mindful of those suppliers, but it all starts with being able to process those invoices faster and more accurately.
Yeah, I would love to see that. And if we're generous, maybe that's why the interest in SRM.
Yeah.
Who knows? So I've got CFO priorities here, and the reason I've got CFO priorities here is because in many, if not most companies, the CPO rolls up to the CFO, and this is essentially what we're hearing from our customers, and our customers are, I would say, more on the larger side than on the smaller side. But economic uncertainty, digital transformation, cost and cash flows, I don't think these would surprise anybody that these are the priorities of the CFO in 2024, 2025. I mean, digital transformation is kind of a perennial. Cost containment, we saw it on the previous survey with 25% not spending money. And economic uncertainty, it essentially is the reason for that. And there's, wherever you look, there's a reason to feel uncertain. And so I'm not surprised by that at all. And I would be impressed. Sorry, not impressed. Please drop a comment in if those are not your priorities. Of course, that's interesting information. On the right-hand side, just got a few stats here. And I do think that they're kind of interesting, at least as by way of starting a conversation. So 75% of global trade still disconnected. For me, this points to a situation where some companies that are digitally transformed versus those that are analog are really going to have a competitive advantage, and there are going to be some winners and losers. And then I look at the 74% of employees being millennial or Gen Z, and I think buying behavior will change. I did not know 4 years ago that I'd be working from home. I mean, you already brought it up. That's a huge change. And then the last point there, the average DPO for an SME is 56 days. This comes from HSBC, and it really just speaks to liquidity that's locked within the sort of the purchase to pay process, and a situation where these suppliers are at risk because they're illiquid and effectively they're giving like interest-free loans to their buyers. And then purchase to pay in the middle, it's a bit self-serving. It answers all these challenges that I've just discussed. But I'll leave it there, and you can tell me if any of this resonates with you and maybe what you've experienced.
Yeah, Rowan, today more than 70% of digital transformation initiatives in organizations are being run by the CFO, not the COO, not the CIO, not the CTO,
Yep.
the CFO. And one reason for that, of course, is the fact that it's a CFO who uniquely has the ability to go across an enterprise and affect that kind of change. But in other respects, I think there's something else going on, and that is the changing role of the CFO. Today, 80% of all CFOs have taken on more responsibilities. They're less of a financial scorekeeper and more of a financial strategist. The organization is leaning on them hard. Don't tell me what happened. Don't tell me what happened last quarter. Tell me what will happen. What if we open this new factory? What if we add this new product line? What if we buy this company? And so they're looking for the CFO to be that strategist to help the company meet its objectives. Now, who is it that's going to help the CFO fulfill those obligations? Well, it's you all. AP, procurement, finance. They're going to need those insights from somewhere. And so this is an environment where they're going to need to rethink the way that they access, leverage, and forecast their data. Here's the problem. It's all that stuff on the right-hand side, right? We have an environment in AP and in Procure to Pay more broadly where it's a hodgepodge of closed-loop networks and standalone systems that don't speak to one another. That's why we rekey all this data. And we lean on our ERPs to provide us with that information, and in many cases it's incorrect or it's outdated. And so we have a scenario where the CFO simply can't do their jobs. And it's only going to get worse as these young people keep coming into our finance departments, look around and say, why the devil are we doing this way? And so we've got to fix this. And Rowan, I think that put it all together, this really is the crying need for P2P automation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's simplistic, but change is coming. That's for sure. All right. We've talked a bit about the challenges. We'll move on to the path to a seamless process. But Mark, you're going to give us another survey.
Indeed, we will. This time I want to know, how has or how will your organization implement the Procure to Pay process? How has or how will your organization implement the Procure to Pay process? Are you going to make tactical investments? Are you going for a full P2P implementation? Are you going to start with invoice digitization and e-invoicing and then go from there? Are you going to start with AP automation and then go from there? Or are you going to start with e-procurement? Take a moment to respond to the poll question, now displayed on your screen, and we'll discuss the results in just a moment. All right, Rowan, so this poll question begs the question, is there a wrong answer? Is there a wrong way to go about implementing the P2P process?
I feel like in light of the previous question, we really needed an answer F, none of the above,
We're just not going to do it.
No. So from my perspective, no, as long as you're moving forward, I think you're doing the right thing. I don't think there's a right way or the wrong way. Fine, I've got a slide later on that kind of starts with digitization of the paper documents and, an effort to get away from emails with PDFs and sort of migrate towards e-invoices, which I do think is a valuable thing. But I wouldn't say there's a wrong way to do it if you do the planning, if you have a planning foundation that allows you to understand your needs first before going on. And we'll talk about it in a minute in terms of, how do you go through that path. So, well, I don't know. Do you have an opinion?
Well, I'm curious. We know that 70% of AP departments have deployed some technology. That doesn't mean they're end-to-end automated, right? They have
No.
something. Maybe it's a
Yep.
maybe it's a scanning solution, maybe it's some OCR, maybe it's a portal hanging off over here for particular suppliers. So they've done some AP automation. The question I think is on the minds of a lot of our attendees, Rowan, is, all right, so what do I do with what I already have? Can I use that as a springboard, or do I have to throw that out as well? What do you do if you already have something, Rowan?
No, that's a really good question, actually. So it might have been SAP a little while ago. They kind of realized that the monolith was going away, and maybe it was Gartner, in fact, who was talking about the monolith of the ERP going away, and in its place was interconnectivity between systems, and for sure the ability for different systems from different vendors to interact through APIs and other methods has just improved greatly. So I would say there's a case for starting fresh, but probably if you have it and you can use it, that's great. I mean, we've got companies using like us for procurement and a competitor for procurement, and essentially they're integrating the two and using our solution for the approval workflow, but the other solution for the catalog management, just as an example. And I think there's a lot of examples like that where, you know, you've made the investment in something, and then you want to put something else in place to address a tactical need.
So we can achieve P2P optimization with a best of breed kind of solution.
I would say for sure, and most solutions these days would probably call themselves best of breeds, even if they are very large platforms. You know, there's still best of breed like. Interesting.
Yeah, we asked our attendees how has or how will your organization implement the procure to pay process. 31% of you say you're going for full P2P implementation. You want the full Monty. 27% of you say you're going to start with invoice digitization, e-invoicing. Yep. 20% of you say you're going to start with AP automation. 15% of you, you're going to start with e-procurement. 12% of you are going to make tactical investments. Is it a good idea to start with e-procurement and maybe hand the keys to the car off to procurement if I'm an AP person, Rowan? Uh-oh, you're laughing.
I'm laughing because, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so when you talk to like a vendor like TradeShift, and I would say we are slightly more finance focused than procurement focused. And most vendors will be, you know, will have had their origin on one side of the aisle or the other. So I tend to think the low-hanging fruit is the third option there, invoice digitization. That's maybe the easier thing, and I would say procurement is one of the harder things. But that doesn't mean it's not useful to start. It's the most upstream process, and it's not necessarily a waste. None of it's wasted.
No, agreed. So tell us more about this digitization journey.
All right. So what I've got here is the world's simplest description of digital transformation, and what I've done, as I oversimplified it, was really just put procure to pay digitization into the biggest buckets I could think of. And so I've got transactions, processes, relationships, and data, and I just think, you know, to some extent, it's about labeling things, you know. So when I talk about transactions, I'm talking about invoices, orders, credit notes, EDI, and everything, advanced shipment notices, everything that goes in there. When I mention processes, some of them are internal and some of them are external. So you've got your rec to order process, your invoice to pay process, your SRM processes, but then you've also got the collaboration between you and your suppliers, or you and your customers for that matter. And these are processes. So AP, procurement, receivables, relationships. Again, we saw those challenges in one of the first slides around stakeholder engagement, and that includes internal stakeholder engagement and engagement with suppliers. A lot of conversation happens around the topic of how can we get finance and procurement to speak to each other. My view is it's with a system. If we have a system that basically links these processes and allows you to collaborate around a document, that builds an audit trail around the document. So you've got the original requisition. I make the requisition. It goes to my boss. They approve it. Maybe there's some commentary. Eventually, a supplier confirms it. We eventually get the invoice. Presumably, we would have had a goods receipt as well. The invoice goes through an approval process. Every one of those little timestamps, comments, and collaborations between stakeholders is there at the end of the day for the auditor to check against that document. So I think there's a lot to be said there for relationships. And then on the data side, I actually in my notes had supplier master data. I had data maintenance, I had catalog management, and then of course reporting and analytics. And you could maybe, well, that's what I had in my notes. And then I realized as I was writing this up that there's so much more. There's security, there's sustainability, there's a variety of other things. But I did want to squeeze it down into something manageable.
Yeah, Rowan, my piece of advice to folks who, as they embark on their digital transformation journey, is to focus on that data block. In finance, we like to talk about how cash is king. You hear people throw that around all the time. Well, my retort to that is data is the trump card, because we're only as good as our data. And that's going to become especially true as we move into this AI-powered environment, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And so we all sit on these filthy vendor master data bases. It's time we clean this up. And so this data, whether it's coming from a vendor master, or it's coming from a CRM, or it's coming from somewhere else in your organization, we have to make sure that we're being mindful of data. And so I think as AP professionals, we've been really focused on the invoice data. I think it's going to behoove us to make sure that we're starting to understand where are these other systems and who's keeping that data clean, and how does that all get aggregated? Because I think at the end of the day, we're only going to be good as our data.
Now, interestingly, so I've got these throwaway words, platform and network, down at the bottom, but in essence, one of the things that we do and many vendors do is try to create a situation where the supplier is maintaining their own data and is incentivized to maintain their own data because they get the benefit of visibility into the invoice status, or faster payment, or supply chain finance, and so there's value in being on a platform and on a network rather than just accepting scan and capture as a route to digitization, because you are really locked out of a collaborative moment with your supplier if that's all you've got.
That's right. I'm going to pay you faster. I'm going to pay you accurately. You'll have visibility into what you're getting paid for. Yeah, I'm willing to help make sure that data gets entered right.
Yeah. All right. So I think our headline for the webinar was around how AP can really play a strong role in P2P transformation. I do think there are some opportunities. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, you could start anywhere and it's valuable, but there are some opportunities. And so how do I think AP helps? So I've got 3 procurement needs on the left here. And we're talking about connecting relationships, we're talking about relationships between buyers and suppliers that might be damaged if the payment's off. We're talking about compliance, which is never easy. SRM is one way to track compliance, but there's another layer of compliance that relates to e-invoicing that needs to be considered. And then fraud is, it's a perennial thing. And on the AP side, I do think there is some opportunity here. So faster invoice cycle times, that's a way to improve the relationship with a supplier. Just make sure they get paid on time. Also, giving them visibility into the invoice status via the portal that you mentioned earlier, Mark, that visibility is useful. E-invoicing compliance, so 20 some odd percent, what was it, 28% earlier said they were going to start with e-invoicing digitization. Mm-hmm. Anywhere but the USA, that's super important. If you're accepting invoices from suppliers in Latin America, there are clearance and compliance regimes all over Europe, more and more, Asia, more and more. So e-invoicing compliance is going to be really useful and is going to be an element of what procurement needs to basically have a compliant relationship with the supplier. And then lastly, there is some risk mitigation within the process of accounts payable automation. I mean, there are ways to detect duplicate invoices. We use AI and business rules to detect duplicate invoices, but we also have systems that just ensure segregation of duties. So on the one hand, you might have like a duplicate invoice, which isn't the same as fraud, but you might actually have fraud. And then you've got analytics that are looking for invoices outside the norm. And then you've got segregation of duties within the system itself to ensure that the same person can't create an invoice and approve it, as an example, or change the bank account number on a supplier to their own without it being flagged. So I think there's a really nice relationship there where procurement's going out on their own and they're trying to manage spend and keep on contract spend and be responsible in that sense, and even maintain a lot of the relationships with suppliers. But then finance is really data driven, and with that data, they have opportunities to ensure the purchasing policy as well as other policies are followed. That was a mouthful.
Yeah. No, well said. And I think, at the end of the day, procurement's sitting on data, AP's sitting on data. How do we share that data in such a way that it improves not only our operations, but our supplier relationships? And it starts, of course, I think, with centralizing and integrating that supplier data, right? From the moment a supplier is onboarded, we've got to create that unified supplier database. We've got to be able to monitor their contract compliance. We've got to be able to identify anomalies that might indicate fraudulent behavior. But then we also do things like the, PO matching, right? So we can have cross-checks of that data. Then we can track supplier performance metrics by the data that we're capturing from the invoices. And then we can also enforce contract compliance. And of course, we can monitor and flag any high-risk activity or even high-risk suppliers. And once we have that platform that you were speaking about, well, now we not only have access to the data, now we have the ability to collaborate with our peers. So we can collaborate with procurement. We can have dual control processes. We're able to have those audit trails so we can see the actions that each of us took. And at the end of the day, we do have those analytics and reporting. While that didn't score high in the poll that we did earlier today, I believe that moving forward, we're going to see more organizations say, hey, I want to get visibility into trend analysis, right? I want to use procurement data to track spend trends. I want to be able to identify unusual spikes in trend in spending or variances in spending. And then AP can use this to compare it to payment trends and be able to uncover discrepancies and maybe even fraud. So I think there's a great opportunity here for us once we've got all this data in one place to leverage it and share it.
Interestingly, you mentioned like analytics. that's, I think, an area that is changing because, in the past we had BI tools and they were generally kind of like very expensive and very
Oh, yeah.
enterprisey. But I mean, as an example, Amazon QuickSights is this generative AI tool that you can drop onto, in our case, it's a data lake, and you can literally just type in, what's my invoice cycle time, and it will very quickly, like virtually instantly, as fast as ChatGPT, it'll give you a dashboard showing you your invoice cycle time. It's really impressive, and I don't know where that takes us beyond a kind of a democratization of BI into the lower mid market, but really interesting stuff. So I would recommend checking that out. All right, we're still talking about the path to P2P here, I think, and so what I've done is I've created a P2P maturity model, and it's really an example of how our customers do it. So this may not be the entire world and how every other company out there sort of goes through the process of maturing in their P2P model. We did ask the survey questions earlier. Where are you going to start? What are you going to do? For the most part, I don't know what the actual stats are, but I would say, I would guess fewer than half do a big bang P2P process. It might, there's a starting point. And for us, the starting point is typically that digitization process. So you get off paper, that's the low-hanging fruit. You get your suppliers onboarded into a digital process, and that actually lets you automate routine and repetitive tasks through invoice automation. That's you setting yourself up with a controlled, efficient process that gives you visibility to bottlenecks, to fraud prevention, things like that. And then you go a little bit upstream, and you start to control your spend, and you implement e-procurement for a more broad, full procure to pay process. And that would definitely include catalog management, rec to order, SRM. If you feel like it, you may not. Not so interesting. We saw a bunch of people interested in SRM, but a lot of companies just don't need such a large process that they need SRM or contract lifecycle management or direct material sourcing. So if you don't need that, you don't need that. And then of course I've got the the shift up to networks. And what I'm using network here is a placeholder for rolling out. So most of our customers, again, they're not necessarily small companies. So they're in multiple countries or they're broadly across the United States. And so there's often a starting point. There's often like a proof of concept or an initial implementation, and then they get that rolling, they get that working, and then they start to roll it out more broadly, another state, different countries, internationally. You talked a little bit earlier, Mark, about the hodgepodge of systems, often multiple ERPs. Yeah, that's the reality. So you can't just blast out a purchase to pay process across everywhere. You'd never finish. You'd never succeed. It would just be too complex. So digitize, then automate, then expand upstream, and then start to use the network and leverage the network to roll this out to other countries and other supplier groups. And then what I've got here is optimize, and I've got the fintech elements, V-cards, supply chain finance, payments. Sometimes this is the hardest part to weave into the whole process, and that's why I've put it there. But in essence, everyone's going to have their own landscape. So my one caveat is this is what I've seen here in TradeShift with TradeShift customers, but I'm interested in what the audience feels is their experience. And Mark, you've had 40 years of experience. How many years was it?
30 years. Please give me back the 10 years. Yeah, this is.
So what have you seen, Mark?
Yeah, I think what we hear from most AP departments is we're somewhere in the digitization automation stage, right? We're trying to find a way to leverage that. And the key message today is this isn't something to feel bad about that you're not as far along as you'd like. It's something to use as a springboard. And that brings us to the next phase of the presentation is how do we actually do that? What are some practical steps for building that collaboration between AP and
Yeah.
procurement? Before we give you those strategies, well, we wanted to do one more poll question, which is now displayed on your screen. This time we want to know, how would you characterize the operational process of procure to pay in your organization? When you think about your procure to pay process, which of the following adjectives come to mind? Perfect, good, adequate, or as we say here in Philly, meh, needs improvement, or needs improvement? I don't know why we have two needs improvements, but that might be Rowan projecting onto our poll question here. Take a moment to respond to the poll question now displayed on your screen, and we're going to discuss.
Yeah, I think if they select the second needs improvement, I think that means they need a lot of improvement.
There we go. I like that. Otherwise, they just wanted to see me do some math and have to put D and E together when we showed the results. We know that most folks would admit that their procure-to-pay process is not ideal, right? What's the biggest gripe you hear about existing procure-to-pay processes, Rowan?
Well, I think the challenge of onboarding suppliers is the most consistent. So we know from the previous polls that digitization is kind of the starting point and maybe even the priority for a good 30% of the audience here in 2025. It's kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? And you've got your 1,000 or 10,000 suppliers, and they're all over the world, or they're all over North America, and you've actually got them you need them to change their process and send you an invoice differently. And if our data is not great, then we can't even communicate with them to ask them to send their e-invoice to a different email address. Yeah.
We asked you, how would you characterize the operational process of procure to pay in your organization? Which adjective comes to mind? 29% of you, meh, it's okay. 27% of you think it's good. 4% of you are living the good life. You think it is a perfect process. 38.3%, yes, I used my iPhone to add them up. 38.3% of you say your process needs improvement. So to give you some ideas on how it is you can go about improving your procure-to-pay process, well, I'm going to hand it back to Rowan.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is just an example of a best practice, and I'm not going to read the slide, but laying the foundation for success really benefits from change management and proactive change management. And I'm just going to highlight the first couple here. Unifying the vision. And if I swear you could have the smallest project in the world, as long as it involves 2 people, let's just make sure that we understand what the goal is, right? And then how do we measure success? And then mapping it out. What are the roles and responsibilities? We've all probably created some kind of a RASI matrix, and it's useful, but it's not easy. It is not easy to follow. And so as a best practice, I would say, don't skimp on this. Don't pretend that change management isn't going to be really important to the ultimate success of the project. Now, I'll give you one anecdote. So I had a customer some years ago, and they had spent 2 years analyzing and figuring out their requirements before they came to market. And actually, I should say before they found us. And they had gone and they'd interviewed a couple of vendors, but they really hadn't found anything they liked, but they kept developing their requirements. And what it meant was, by the time they selected a solution, they were able to articulate to the vendor exactly what it was that they wanted, and then they got that. And that made a difference, right? And then they, you know, they had a roadmap, and they did all the work. Anyway, so I would say, take the time. Take the time. What do you think about change management, Mark? Just before we jump onto the KPIs.
Yeah, I was going to say it starts, of course, with getting buy-in from senior management, right? Get them behind you. That'll help smooth some of the sailing later on. Get stakeholder involvement early on, right? Find out where they believe the gaps are in your process. Understand what it is their hopes and aspirations are for a solution. You know, and then you got to start. You've got to be ready for inevitable objections. So, what happens when you have some resistance to the change? Right? Make sure you establish a clear implementation plan. Make sure that as part of that plan, you're communicating the benefits of what it is you're trying to achieve. Make sure you sell folks on why it is you're doing this, right? Change is hard for people, particularly in an environment where they've been trained to think that technology is going to be the end of their job. Make sure you train them. You know, you're giving them the tools they need. Plan for the fact that they might be remote. So those are some things that I would do. And then, of course, as you go along, you're going to make sure you're monitoring. So you're making sure that you're keeping on track. And in order to do that, well, now you're going to need key performance indicators. And these are some great ones, Rowan. I think that these are the types of things. We find that a lot of IOFM members don't track any KPIs in your organization. If there's one thing you remember from what Rowan and I discussed today, it's that you should be tracking KPIs. Whether you're automating with P2P or just trying to get the most out of your current environment, KPIs give you a baseline, right? They shine a light on deficiencies in your organization. They show you where you need to focus your efforts, and they give you something to measure your team and your solution by.
Yeah, and these are just examples. The only thing I'd say, I'd add to what you just said, Mark, is the project itself will require other KPIs. This is what happens once your solution is up and running. So best practices. So all I've done here is tell the audience exactly what they know, but it is true. The goal for most of us is to automate everything that you possibly can within the procure to pay process. And this is removing all the routine and repetitive tasks that cost you money. It is a best practice. Enforce compliance. The system will do it, but you have to do it as well. Mark, you mentioned engaging with suppliers, and you mentioned the value of suppliers and the realization, the changing realization of their importance. I absolutely believe that. And we could do another whole hour on the value of suppliers and supplier collaboration. So I won't belabor it. And because I know we're running out of time, and we're going to have hopefully a couple of questions. So measure and improve. I'm just repeating myself, saying that. So we won't worry about it. This is my final slide. And this is really just how to sort of pull it all together. And this is a reminder of what we've just talked about. We've talked about the challenges. We've talked about having a path that includes a framework for collaboration. And then we've talked about, what some practical tools for collaboration might be. And essentially, we've said, don't underestimate change management. We've said, figure a way to measure your process so that you can see if you're succeeding or not. We've talked about tools. TradeShift is a tool. Lots of tools out there. And then one thing I like to say is it's about inching forward. You just got to move forward. I don't think there's a wrong way to do it, and I do think that it's okay to experiment and learn from the process, and in essence, kind of sharpen the saw and then do it all again.
And that brings us to the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you haven't already submitted your question for Rowan, or if you've thought of another question for Rowan, go ahead, use the Q&A tool on your screen to submit your question to me now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Our first question up is from Deborah. She writes, waiting on procurement can often cause late payments. What are some best ways to help this along when you're waiting on approvals or even on procurement?
I don't even know if I understand that. I mean, if you're waiting on procurement for what, an order, like approval? I mean, do you have an invoice already? What are we waiting on?
Deborah, if you could reply, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to clarify your question. I'll do it in writing after the fact, Deborah. But yeah, procurement's the worst. That's just my opinion.
Robin writes in. Now that's a topic for another webinar. Robin writes in, how do auditors adjust to no invoice for them to look at? Many approvers want to see the invoice.
Yes, auditors do need the invoice and the audit trail. I can only think of making purchases through like a virtual card or a P card, and therefore there will still be an invoice and there will still be a reconciliation. It gets a little bit harder, but for a payment, I mean, there's got to be some kind of an audit trail. I don't know Mark, if you think that there's a better answer for that question. It's a tough one.
Tim writes in, any suggestions for streamlining onboarding and supplier maintenance, supplier information maintenance?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously there's a few different ways you can onboard, taking the master vendor file, segmenting it into largest and smallest by invoice volumes, and then reaching out to them with different methods, whether it's phone calls for the largest ones and email sort of marketing style for the smallest ones. You need that outreach, but then you also need the portal that engages them. What we've done at TradeShift, we've done a couple things, but one of the things is we've given access to information on the portal without them actually having to sign up. So essentially they can follow a link in an email that takes them and shows them some information like an invoice status, and they're encouraged to sign up because they get more information. And then once they're we're capturing their data and they're maintaining their data and they're incentivized.
Karina writes, what is the standard or benchmark processing time for an invoice in a shared services model? Are there any rules of thumb for how long it should take to process an invoice if you're in a shared services model?
Yeah, I would generally say the best in class is like sub 3 days, and average would be around 10-12 days. And then if you've got slightly more automated processes, really it's nearly instant.
And that will be our final word. Rowan, thanks so much for an excellent presentation and for sharing all your insights with us today. And thank all of you for taking time out of your busy days to join us. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Laura. Ms. Laura.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rowan. I do have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we officially close out. As a reminder, the on-demand materials will be emailed to everyone within the next 2 business days. This will be a link to access the webinar console again, to replay the webinar and download the slides. Also, if you could please fill out the brief evaluation form that will appear on the webinar console shortly. This will help us better serve your needs in future webinars, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Thank you again to Rowan and Mark for a great webinar today, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. This webinar was brought to you by IOFM and sponsored by TradeShift. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.